And as we begin, I would like to acknowledge and honor the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and Treaty 7 people, including the Siksina, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Thank you in perpetuity for the privilege of working, learning, and living on this land now, enabling this talk. So we are very happy to welcome Jennifer Eichman, who, as well as being a longtime friend, has held many roles in academia, including research associate at the Center for Buddhist Studies at SOAS, where we have done a couple of events together, and has taught most recently at Zhengzhou University in Taiwan. Her first monograph, A Late 16th Century Chinese Buddhist Fellowship, Spiritual Ambitions, Intellectual Debates, and Epistolary Connections, published by Brill in 2016, focused on a network of elite male literati and their letter exchanges to argue for the sustaining power of associative life in the creation of a Chinese Buddhist fellowship. Her current scholarship continues to explore the relationship between network and discourse in a number of different contexts, specifically in relation to female religious practices, Buddhist reading practices, and the widespread 16th century attempts to synthesize Buddhist, Confucian, and Taoist ideas under a single unifying tradition. And, may I say, personally, Jennifer's work with text is just a model for students. She's able to draw meaning out of a variety of traditional, scriptural works, as well as put them into conversation with more culturally ephemeral works, we might say, like letters or lesser known works. So I'm looking forward very much to her talk today, elucidating the network of the abbess Zhujin and her family and intellectual network. So I'm very glad she could join us, and welcome to Dr. Jennifer Eichman.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. Should I push share screen? Not yet. Can you can see me as a speaker right now?
Right.
You can.
Yes. And when you want to switch to slides, I think Courtney enabled you as a co-host. Oh, hi, Jessica. See you. So then you can share your slides.
Okay, let me put this up. Okay, can you see the slides now?
Yes, we can.
I'm going to did something funny on my screen. So you can only see the slides. You can't see the rest of my computer screen, or you can see everything?
We can only see the slides, and then we see you in a side, or at least I'm seeing you in a sidebar of the speaker, of the participants.
Okay.
So
okay.
Yeah, right now, at least for me, I'm seeing a very nice, full screen of the slides with everybody off to the side.
Okay. All right. So let me go ahead then and begin. I am somewhat conflicted about this paper. I've given it 3 or 4 different titles at different times. And I have a paper. I will read part of the paper, but I also present some things that aren't in the paper. And I was thinking about this more in the sense of, if I could sit down with graduate students and we have a cup of tea and we look over some primary sources, and then just work our way towards the bigger, larger issues. So I'm going to try to do a little bit of that kind of work at the same time that I do present some pieces of what I have in the paper. At one point, someone said to me, "Are you going to turn this into a book?" And I said, "Well, no, it's only one nun. It's only 6 or 7 texts, they're very rich texts, but I didn't think it was enough." But I'm finding in writing the paper, I've already, the graduate students who have joined this talk have already received a copy of my previous paper on the nunnery itself and on the communal rules that govern life at that nunnery. But each time I write a paper, and there could be another 2 or 3, I need to repeat the same story. So it's occurred to me that perhaps I should write a paper in 2 parts and find someone who would, a journal that would publish part 1 and part 2, and then I wouldn't have to repeat the first part. But there's so many different sources that it's turned out that this has become a very rich project for me. Now, I'm going to start just by reading the introduction to my paper. And so I start with this piece from the stupa epitaph. In ancient times, Shanhui led her into the tradition through her desire, and Gopika became his Kalyana Mitra wife. This power of wisdom was maintained through 2 Asamkhya kalpas, naturally so matched in marriage, like tins stuck together and magnets attracted to each other. Who knows how it started? The references to magnetic attraction and marriage appear at first glance to signal that we are reading an excerpt drawn from a romance novel. Yet upon closer inspection, it becomes clear that this is an allusion to an episode in one of the many past life stories of the Buddhist Shakyamuni. In this instance, his marriage to the flower seller Gopika. But why allude to a relationship maintained over incalculable eons, that's the Asamkhya kalpas, to a religious helpmeet, the Kalyana Mitra wife, in an epitaph commemorating the life of a late 16th century Chinese Buddhist nun? What were the underlying historical realities that prompted our writer to offer such an idealized portrait of a marriage? As this article will demonstrate, the epitaph was written to cement the reputations of both the married nun Zhujin, the abbess of the nunnery Filiality and Righteousness Unobstructed, located in Hangzhou, and that of her late monk husband, Zhuhong, the revered abbot of Cloud Dwelling Monastery, located near the West Lake in Hangzhou. Zhujin was, of course, celibate. Yet the allusion would have been all too clear to the monastic and lay participants in their local Buddhist community. By drawing on the spiritual authority of Shakyamuni, the epitaph wraps this late 16th century couple in the aura of karmic inevitability, a choice that effectively smoothed over decades of familial strife and greed generated by Zhuhong's natal family, the Shen clan. For it was this clan who objected to his tonsuring, forced his wife to adopt an heir, and laid the groundwork to disband the nunnery and claim its property as their own upon her death, thus setting off a crisis of legitimation. The particular stupa epitaph gives unusually equal billing to the relationship between Zhujin and Zhuhong, yet it is not the only representation we have either of their relationship or of their monastic lives. One question that continues to occupy scholarly work on the history of women's lives in China concerns our ability to distill the difference between idealized portraits and historical realities. So this is one of the bigger issues. What's the difference between idealized portrait and the historical realities? Many scholarly works have effectively analyzed the structure of biological genres, highlighting the processes of their production and the repetition of various idealized tropes of exemplarity. An appreciation of these tropes is crucial to our dissection of the ideal public image. After all available sources on Zhujin's life and that of many other women were written by men for a broader reading public. So there was a time when people simply just read texts. Then in the field, given the historiography of the field, we got around to thinking about genre and how genres are structured and what the tropes are in those genres and what the templates are for producing a standardization of stories of people's biographies, what we might call the hagiography of the tradition. There are no personal letters that remain between husband and wife in this case, nor is there any extant volume of Zhujin's writings. Yet in teasing apart the circumstances under which this nun lived, we have more than one source and thus more than one image. The fame of the husband monk, the level of family strife, and the success in building a nunnery and installing Zhujin as the abbess all contributed to the creation of a series of texts that expose family dynamics, shore up a public image, and entertain an audience. The family dynamics, marriage relations, woodblock image locating her stupa, and later creation of a room for devotion to her material effects are described in temple gazetteer writings, a play script, and various hagiographical collections. The play script is the one source to offer an actual portrait, however inaccurate, and I'll show that to you in a moment. The earliest writings portray the precariousness of her position. However, later hagiographical collections with formulaic templates excise the turmoil surrounding Zhujin's life circumstances and simply reified her rebirth in the Pure Land of Amitabha Buddha. The text analyzed here further evince what a growing number of scholars have come to realize. Induction into a Buddhist monastic community did not result in a full renunciation of familial and friendship ties comparable to a social death. And in my footnotes, I mention Wendy Adamick's work, I mention Kate Lingley, I mention a number of other scholars, mostly scholars who've worked on earlier traditions. There are not that many scholars working on 15th, 16th, and 17th century lives of nuns and monks who have discussed this issue. In Zhujin's case, there was a recalibration of social distance within familial and social networks, one premised on a realignment of the relationship between authority and autonomy. Zhuhong himself sought to distance himself from his family, physically, emotionally, and financially. So we do have separation. Yet despite having taken the tonsure, he did not repudiate his wife. To the contrary, distressed by the Shen clan treatment of her, he devoted considerable energy to reasserting his familial authority in regard to her domestic situation. There is no hint of sexual impropriety, yet this is certainly not the emotionally neutral, distant portrayal we have come to expect between monastics and their families, let alone between a monk and a nun. After she was installed as the abbess, Zhuhong was most alarmed by the Shen clan claims to rights of inheritance and the division of monastic property and wealth, claims he sought to weaken. Zhuhong's authority was established in part through litigating her circumstances in the court of public and religious opinion. To that end, he and others wrote an extensive collection of texts on the life of the abbess and the history of the nunnery, published under the title, A Record of the Nunnery, Filiality and Righteousness. Both the biography and the stupa epitaph are part of that record. This article will focus foremost on analysis of the stupa epitaph, which is translated in full, to contextualize both the life story behind this epitaph and the epitaph's thematic content. This article will first present Zhuhong's biography of his wife Nun, a work that became foundational for all subsequent discussions of her life, and one that contrasts sharply with the image we see of her in the epitaph. Zhujin's story presents a unique case study, yet the broader themes of how to balance renunciation with familial contact and how to shift the weight of a marital relationship from one of material sustenance to that of spiritual mentorship underscores two of the main issues facing men and women tonsured as adults who chose to live in monastic communities and may resonate as well during other times and places. My goal here is to leave the reader with a more textured portrait of Zhujin and a better grasp of the familial issues potentially faced by 16th century monks and nuns. So let me first just talk a little bit about the table of contents for this very unusual record. We do not have these kinds of records for every nunnery. In fact, it's very hard to find records of this sort. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, with these 6 records. Yeah, 6 records. The ones with the asterisks I've already published on in the article listed at the bottom, Zhuhong's Communal Rules for the Late Ming Nunnery, Filiality and Righteousness Unobstructed. I translated them either in part or in full. Today, I will talk a little bit, I will reintroduce the final admonitions. I will give a section from the further admonitions and then focus on the record of the Virtuous and the stupa epitaph. Within this story, the historical actors consist of Zhuhong, who's the husband monk, Zhujin, the wife nun. Notice they both have the character Zhu. Their names start with Zhu. These are their Dharma names because they received their Dharma names under the same monk. We have the Shun family, it's his family clan. Shun Wenbin is the adopted nephew, and Wu Yingbin wrote the stupa epitaph. So just wanted to introduce these names because they'll be coming up throughout this talk. Now, in terms of the crisis of legitimation, I'm going to start with this and then work back towards the biographies. So in parting admonitions, there's first a section that explains how the nunnery came together, but then Zhuhong has this to say, and these were written in 1606. Zhuhong was already quite elderly, so was the abbess. He writes these in 1606, probably because he thought he was close to death. He may have been ill, he was often ill. And then we have another set in 1611. So what we see is that this crisis of legitimation it keeps festering ever since there was an adopted nephew, an adopted heir. He just doesn't seem to be able to quite divest himself of that heir and of the Shen's clan's interest in property and money. Okay, so as it says, as for this nunnery, every last bit came into being through the almsgiving of Dhanapati. Outside this, not the tiniest fraction had anything to do with the Shen family. Later generations did not know these particulars. In the event that anyone develops aberrant views and recklessly plunder this wealth, then this is to insult the self, insult the benefactors of the 10 directions, insult the district magistrate, and insult me and my deceased parents' ancestors. What more, Tong's disciples, their disciples, and her longtime monastic companions. Okay, so he's really, his tactic here is shaming the family, right? Public shaming of those who would even think these thoughts. Even if Tong's disciple companions were to diminish greatly in number, still there must be a search elsewhere for an experienced, dedicated nun abbess who will forever uphold the name of filiality and righteousness among the lay community. If this is not possible, and I fear that as the years progress, the nunnery will fall into neglect. For this reason, I have written this and had it carved on wood blocks. These admonitions will serve as evidence, submitted in hope that those who are wise will heed this clear warning. Well, they didn't heed this clear warning. And so in 1611, he revisits this issue. And I will give just a few excerpts from this much longer text. He says, before the abbess took the tonsure, there was a nephew who married into the Shu family of Jiangan named Wenbin. He wanted to be our heir. I refused to permit this, but he forced her into it. However, while his name was registered with the Shun family, his body resided at the Shu residence. He never lived with her. He never greeted her in the morning or evening as one would greet one's parents, or handled household affairs on her behalf. Okay, so now instead of shaming, he's come up with a set of standards that would signal that someone was behaving as a son towards a mother. And he's saying, well, we didn't see that here. All these things need to happen for me to think that this was a legitimate heir. And so after she became a nun, she divided the fields and houses and separated monastic affairs from lay ones. Thus, this talk of his being her heir ceased and absolutely no longer exists. All of this is explained in the stele inscription of Vice Prefect Song. So those of you who read the article that was pre-distributed, you will have seen that in the stele, there's also a discussion of this same set of issues. Now, farther down in this text, he then says, now, she and Guangzhan, this is the adopted nephew, were like mother and son when she was a layperson. After she left the household, they became master and disciple, which is why he has this name Guangzhan. The precept disciples of Zhuhong, their names either start with Guang, Da, or Zhi. And in the Guang generation of precept disciples, clearly we have his name. Now, it also raises this issue, which we saw in the other article, of are these really her disciples or his disciples, or does this make the nunnery a branch temple of the monastery, or the monastery is the protective umbrella under which this nunnery exists? Moreover, this was clearly witnessed by numerous disciples and virtuous friends. Please listen carefully to my words. and do not let things become chaotic after she passes. So what follows then is a list of funeral instructions and arrangements. And talking about nuns' funerals could be yet a separate paper, depending on whether I can find any other sources besides what I have in that very rich list.
If you hear something, I just need to turn my computer down because I just...
Hello? Okay, so
we're not hearing anything. Go ahead. Yeah.
okay. So he lays out for the family that no, they don't need to buy a coffin. No, they don't need to buy a robe for her. No, they do not need to put together a pavilion. They do not need to hire professional mourners. They do not need to do anything. In fact, I think he wishes that they would just simply stay away. And number 9 in this list says this: as for the property she had before being tonsured, it has been divided and given to Wenbin and the other nephews, with a greater portion of household items going to Wenbin. These transactions have already concluded. Outside this, there are no objects of gold, jade, pearls, green jade, damask silk, fine silk, coarse silk, satin, or other items worth any money. Her everyday attire consists of cotton shoes and an old robe. And I want you to remember that sentence, because in a minute we'll see another perception of what she actually wore. So her everyday attire consists of cotton shoes and an old robe. As for the books, pictures, incense burners, vases, desks, chairs, and bulky everyday household items, these were all purchased by the nunnery of Filiality and Righteousness. All are the property of the monastic community and are communally shared items. There is no need to rely on worldly convention and divide household property, thereby initiating a struggle. Okay, so this claim that they're communally owned, they're not just owned by her individually, which weakens their claim on it. And they were not bought by them, which weakens their claim on these things. And he also, in other texts, discusses having the contracts for the buying of the house and the selling of various items, or the donations of money to put in statues. So he's been very careful with his record keeping. And he ends this by saying, since the abbess has already left home and is, of course, a monastic member, when she dies, everything will be passed on to her disciples. There will be no need to rely on the worldly convention of the family clan arriving to handle household affairs. Okay, so he reinforces this, and please don't show up. Please, if there must be some sense that if they were to take over the funeral procedures, that they then would have already put in motion a series of events that would lead to their ability to divide up the property and take what they wanted for themselves. So we can see that he tonsured in 1566. The adopted heir comes in maybe 10, 15 years later. At the time that the adoption occurs, he probably doesn't have the power to come back and annul it. But as he becomes a famous monk, and as he gathers many, many disciples who have the wealth to be donors, then it comes to things come into place, fall into place, so that houses can be bought and combined and the nunnery can be constructed. So I want to turn now just to a chronology of what went on in her life. And the years here are really, in the Chinese counting system, the first year in the womb is counted as a year. Okay, so these years, some of these, I probably could have changed the slide a little bit in terms of the years that I put in. But let me just read the stupa epitaph biography. At 14 years of age, the abbess, Nei Tang, on account of her mother, kept a vegetarian diet. At 16, she went to her husband's room. At 19, she followed the great master to the gate of the monk, Xingtian of southern Wutai, and became an upashika disciple, precept disciple. Her dharma name was Zhujin. At 47, she renounced worldly life and received the full nun precepts. She lived in a rented house, burning incense in front of Buddha image and cultivating other practices. Throughout her sincere cultivation, she gained the respect of her peers. When she was 59, the nunnery Filiality and Righteousness was completed. On that occasion, the great vice prefect, Song Tonggang, wrote a commemoration, had it carved in stone. 1 year before the great master's nirvana, the abbess, who had been ill for many months, suddenly told her assistants to lift her, supporting her under her arms, and said, "I will recite the name 10 times and then depart." She sat up straight, recited the Buddha's name, this is the Buddha Amitabha, and passed away on the 13th day of the 8th month of the Wanli reign year. This would be 1614. From her birth on the 9th day of the 12th month of Zhujin, which is 1548, until now, she has lived 67 years. Moreover, she was ordained for 21 years. Her students called her Master Taisu. Okay, so from this biography, we just get pretty much a listing of the facts. And we know that because she recited 10 times, or the readers would know that because she recited 10 times, that she was reborn in the Pure Land on the lowest of the 9 rungs. If you recite 10 times, at the end you have a calm mind and can recite right before you die. It's not a death by accident or a horrible death, but a peaceful death. You can be reborn in the Pure Land. So from the stupa epitaph's biography, it's clear that that writer thinks that she has been reborn in the Pure Land. Now we will see that the husband has a rather different sense of some of this. Now, if we think about Zhujin and who she was, I thought for a while that maybe I should title the paper "The Many Faces of Zhujin." And we have two images here, radically different, one with a nice round face, one with a thinner face. And there is an episode in the play, a Pure Land transmission of the lamp, the mirror of the return to the origin. And in this play, in the printed woodblock version of the play, there's in the first part, a number of images that accompany the text. The actual play scripts that were performed, none of those scripts that are extant that I've seen include the episode devoted to her life. Now, what's interesting with these images is that the dress you see here, the headdress and the streamers coming down, is really a Taoist headdress. And in fact, the clothing, even that she's holding this fly whisk, there's a Taoist term for it, there's a Buddhist term for it. Within circles of scholars that study drama, there's a sense that Taoist and Buddhist nuns were depicted in the same way in a number of these woodblock prints. And perhaps also that was true on stage. And that's an issue that I'm still thinking about and trying to work through. You notice also the hair. So the question is this, and I'll show you the larger pictures, is this a depiction of, it is a depiction of this scene in the play, which is that the abbess explains scripture. So the drum is hit, they are all called to the hall, they sit and they listen to her talk. Okay. But whether the hall looked like this or not, whether there was anything close, we don't know. What we do know is that if we look at this from the history of perception, is that there were people who thought that this was a plausible view. This is a plausible way to look at how a nunnery would have been constructed, of what the nuns would have looked like, of what might have transpired there, of what an altar would have looked like. And that these images, because they were printed over and over again, all the way up through the Republican era, would have, at least in the minds of those who had access to these scripts, perhaps gotten them to think that this is what she looked like, or this is what the nunnery looked like. Now, it could be also that the women that we see here, depending on the time period, is it really women or are they men dressed as women? Is it just the actors or actresses, right? There's that issue to be dealt with also. Now, in the 1934 Cloud-Dwelling Monastery Gazetteer, we have this one very short, intriguing entry, and it's about the portrait of the abbess of the nunnery Filiality and Righteousness. We don't have the portrait. If we had the portrait, that'd be another big paper, right? To have a real portrait of a nun, and a nun of this sort would be absolutely fantastic. Okay, and the entry says, at Cloud-Dwelling Monastery, there is a hall to his consort. In a side room is displayed the abbess's Chan meditation chair, brocade blanket, and embroidered shoes, all laid out in splendid fashion. Okay, we just saw a text where Zhuhong claims that she wore cotton shoes and plain robes, right? But here we have, yet we could again look at this in terms of the afterlife or the later reception of Zhujin. We could see what perhaps practitioners wanted, what practitioners set up at some point. And they set up a hall that includes these far more intricately woven and splendid items, particularly the embroidered shoes. Now that is called, he uses the term fu ren, a hall for a wife with a title. The title fu ren is usually for a woman in an elite family, and there were many, many titles that women could have, and it often depended on their husband's success in official life. This term is often translated consort. Now, we do find in some parts of China, particularly Fujian, in the southern sections, a number of god cults had provided wives for the gods. And in some sense, it was a notion that the god's story should be filled out, and that it was more complete if he had a wife, and you will find halls to wives. Now, whether this follows that tradition or follows another tradition, that's something I'm still in the process of researching. And if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd certainly be happy to hear about them. We don't see a mention to this in the earlier in the 16th century sources. Now, I want to turn to the biography. Zhuhong's biography of his nun wife is noteworthy on several accounts. First, Zhuhong uses the occasion to litigate his own story, making himself the de facto autobiographical subject of his wife's biography, not as an eminent monk, which he was, but as a husband still defending his choice to tonsured. In upending convention, he allows their prior domestic relationship to supersede any positive reference to her later leadership of a small nunnery. In a word, he shapes her story by the way he uses her agency to defend his own choices. Now, use of agency, often in women's studies, particularly in the 1970s and 80s, there was a lot of emphasis on trying to find agency and agency in text, particularly if we could find texts written by women. I think agency is still important here. It's also important to look at orality and the way that a woman is given a voice in a man's text, which I think, and if we can find texts written by women, that's okay. We can still talk about how noisy and voicing they were, how much they had to say in text they never wrote. Okay, I think you'll see some of that here today. Secondly, his depiction is aligned with new late 16th century trends in which husbands were far more emotive and critical in their commemorations of their wives. Late Ming biographies and epitaphs of elite Confucian women often highlight a wife's virtue, filial piety, and fidelity, a biographical mode Zhuhong adopts. Yet he dwells on his wife's undesirable traits and limitations, a mode of writing that resonates with what Martin Huang has identified as a mid to late Ming trend in which husbands in mourning departed from the usual impenetrable elite tropes to introduce more personal details, including their wife's character flaws. In eschewing standard monastic description, Zhuhong clearly controls the narrative here. He steers a reader toward 3 seminal episodes intimately connected to their relationship, giving her agency, first in the form of a recollected conversation that highlights her voiced approval of his choice to abandon her, to pursue a monastic vocation. Secondly, she is praised for praying for his well-being when he took ill far from home. But agency can be a decidedly mixed bag. In the 3rd episode, he faults her for succumbing to pressure, or is it choosing to adopt an heir? This exercise of agency causes a crisis of legitimation that draws him back into family affairs, which he resents. This fateful decision is one he ties directly to her uncertain prospects for rebirth in the Pure Land, a shocking claim that all later hagiographies simply ignore, including the stupa epitaph. Okay, so I'm just going to read and walk you through these parts of this text. he starts out with the abbess was surnamed Tang, her father was Xiaojiang, her mother was surnamed Zhu. At 14 Sui, in honor of her mother, she was determined to uphold the blood bowl ritual for 3 years. This is the only text that mentions the blood bowl ritual. All the rest of them simply say that she kept a vegetarian diet for her mother, with her mother, something of that sort. So, but what the blood bowl ritual could be Buddhist, it could also be Taoist, or it could just be something that a lot of different people practiced. So one small thread here. But notice then he immediately turns after that. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't elaborate on her background. He turns to his own background. He says, when I was 29 Sui, my wife died. I did not wish to remarry, but my only son died in infancy. So to honor my mother's wishes, I remarried. During the marriage procurement, from what the abbess said, I was pleased to discover that our religious paths were compatible and thus resolutely agreed to marry her. Several years later, my mother passed away. Once the coffin had been interred, I subsequently renewed my determination to leave home to be tonsured. What he doesn't say here is his father died and then his mother died. And because there were 2 deaths and his wife likely mourned the death of one or both of those parents, he could not repudiate her. In other words, he could not, what in modern terms we might call, divorce her. He couldn't send her back to her natal family. That was against the Great Ming Code. And I suspect that might be one of the considerations in why she then remains with his clan. The biography then proceeds to this point. It says, not long after, due to illness, I returned from faraway travels and dwelt in a rustic abode deep in the mountains. Suddenly, someone came to inform me that my nephew Wenbin was about to become my heir. When I took the tantra, I already had no thought of having a son. Now, on what account could this have happened? Although I immediately rejected the arrangement, I was informed that this had already transpired and could not be undone. I thought that since I had already taken the tonsure, I could not further permit there to be a male heir in this chaste widow's house. Okay, so he comes up with yet another rationale, another male, and shouzhi, a chaste widow of shouzhi is to remain chaste. It's usually used metaphorically. It means that one remains widowed and doesn't remarry, doesn't have any affairs, and is celibate. This is not a natural human relationship. And so there was no need to accommodate this request. Not long after, the abbess also took the tonsure and became a nun. Thereupon, everything that she had in her small estate was distributed among the nephews. Moreover, she favored Bing. From then onward, she turned her home into a nunnery and changed from a layperson into a monastic, and the discussions of an heir became nothing more than an illusion. Okay, so became nothing more than an illusion, except that we've already seen in other texts where he says quite clearly that they had a mother-son and then a master-disciple relationship. So it's really not an illusion, and his rationale sometimes, I don't know if he's having an argument with himself as much as he's having an argument with his family, or if he's having an argument with those who he thinks will read this text. In giving her agency, he then further says this. In the past, when I wanted to leave home, I wrote a letter request to the Provincial Education Commissioner. My paternal cousin, Shen Sanzhou, secretly stopped its arrival. The abbess said to me, I knew about this. If I did not tell you about it, later you would see me as the terrible wife who destroyed your affairs. Okay, so she's seen here as a helpmeet. She's seen here as someone who puts her husband's wishes, her husband's desires first, and does everything to support them. He says, I was moved to tears. On the night I left, I left to take the tonsure. My elder and younger brothers and close friends who sought to detain me goaded the abbess to take the lead, and then they followed her. The abbess said, I have often heard him speak of the enormity of this affair of life and death, and so what reason could there possibly be to obstruct him? I hope that none of you say another word. Now, we need to remember that at this point, she is actually very, very young, and she is the one who stands to lose the most should he leave, and leave her with his relatives who didn't support his choices. Okay, so it puts her in a somewhat precarious situation, and also leaves her with his inheritance because his father and official mother have passed, and because she has no sons. Usually that inheritance goes to the children, goes to the son, and the wife is more or less the caretaker of that inheritance until the children take it over. But there are no children here. He says, later, I became ill in Nanjing and almost died. The abbess heard about it. She rushed to prostrate before the Dipper in an appeal for protection. The wife of my father's eldest brother, respectful Lady Ni, said to the various wives and daughters, are you all aware of this? Her husband abandoned her to take the tonsure, yet she does not harbor hatred and resentment, but to the contrary, prays for the alleviation of his illness. This is quite rare. I hope that you will all emulate her. Alas, that I experienced her generosity when I took the tonsure and nothing more to worry about. This was due to the abbess's fortitude and spiritual liberation. So up to this point, the things that we see her doing are all for his benefit, and he praises her, right? Because she's of benefit to him, things have worked out quite well. Now, there's a turn that happens in this text, and he says, yet, but this is to be regretted. What is to be regretted is her misplaced trust in someone who was incorrect and her blunder in adopting an heir. Moreover, after she was tonsured, in dividing her attention between cultivating the way and still managing household affairs. This is the only place, again, where we see this. What household affairs was she managing? What was this about? We don't know. It became difficult to maintain order. Although a Pure Land rebirth is not assured, her implementation of Buddhist practice was flawless. At the end of her life, she had correct thoughts. The wisdom foundation that she planted for the future was not superficial. How virtuous she is. Okay, so I've highlighted in red this wei ke bi in the Chinese and in the English. The bi in Chinese is pretty strong, like bi ran, or something that absolutely must happen, should happen, that it's assured of, right? But here, the wei ke, the two characters before that, well, maybe not. Maybe because she adopted this heir and then she split her attention wasn't fully on practicing Buddhism and she was managing little household affairs. No, maybe she wasn't reborn in the Pure Land. Okay, so that little bit is never repeated in any other source. They've all glossed over it. Now, the rest of the biography follows pretty much what you've already heard from the stupa epitaph. He discusses the years that she spent as an abbess, how old she was, and then he discusses her being ill and reciting 10 times. He adds one detail that again isn't repeated anywhere else, and then he says that she had stopped eating and that she was emaciated. So he gives that description. That all gets glossed over. In the hagiographic tradition, usually it would just be said, maybe it would be said that she was ill, but then it would be said, the important part is she recited 10 times and she was reborn in the Pure Land. And most texts would end that way, and then you'd go on to the next biography, which would say something quite similar. Now, in terms of the afterlife of her biography, in a record of Pure Land sages and worthies, and I sometimes wonder now about this Xian character, because Zhuhong uses that character in his title for this collection of biographies he's going to write on nuns. And I wonder sometimes if maybe instead of worthies, the sages, it's the sages and the virtuous, and Xian is used more often for women. I'm just sort of have that in the back of my mind to think about. In that text, she's reborn in the Pure Land. And it does follow the text that we've just seen, but all of the angst is simply gone. In this other very rare text, which is in Taipei's National Library, Guojia Tushuguan, the Tathagata's Incensed, this text, which I think has barely been studied, has a section called Biographies of Eminent Nuns. And she is now classified as an eminent nun who's reborn. It's the rebirth of eminent nuns, and her biography is put in that section. Okay, so from in the later period, many of the hagiographies take it as absolute truth that yes, she was reborn in the Pure Land, and that's why we've collected her biography and put it in our collections. And they don't follow anything that Zhuhong may have said in his biography. Provincial gazetteers in other words, I could write an entire paper or another chapter on the afterlife of Zhujin's biographies and afterlife sources about her. In those, most of the biographies of her follow the stele text, but they don't even discuss the Pure Land rebirth, which is also quite interesting, and I think something to note in terms of how we think about the history of nuns and how nuns are depicted and what sources they're depicted in and how. I must also add that there are some discussions of the text that I just read. A little bit of the biography is discussed in Yujun Feng's study of Zhuhong. So you can see some of it discussed there if you'd like to turn to that text too. Now, so for the, let's see if I can. Let me just find where I'm at in my pages here. So let me just say in sum that with that first text, that Zhuhong never again lived within his clan's compound, yet he felt compelled to reassert patriarchal authority. Positioning himself as the head of the household, he protests vehemently against the impropriety of having a chaste widow live with a male adoptee. Zhuhong soundly rejects a nephew, but he cannot sever the relationship. In response, he becomes Zhujin's protector and defender, and further assumed the role of guardian, protector, and spiritual authority at the nunnery by imposing a number of restricted regulations on the everyday activities of its monastic residents, while all the while he kept his family at bay. In sum, the image of her perpetuated throughout this biography is one of fidelity toward her husband, that is, righteousness in her chaste widowhood, and filial behavior in attending to his birth mother and ritual sacrifices to his ancestors, the two virtues for which the nunnery is named. And yet we are also left with the distinct impression that her flaws, as he saw them, had a negative karmic impact on her religious prospects. In this biography, he does not grieve her death. For any feelings about her, we need to turn to what became a famous set of poems. And those poems I'll talk about at the very end. The poems, again, one set of poems is translated in Yujun Feng's book. The other set of poems, maybe I'll email you later, Yujun Feng, about that, because they're interesting and seem to appear only first in the play and not in his regular works. So now if we turn to the stupa epitaph. The stupa epitaph is written by the consummate writer of early 17th century Buddhist epitaphs and monk biographies, Wu Yingbin, a precept disciple of Zhuhong, whose depth of Buddhist training, literary writing skills, and congenial connections to this couple made him an ideal choice for the task of keeping the tensions of actual real-life events from intruding on the positive Buddhist narratives so desired for the public shaping of Zhujin's life story. The epitaph simultaneously romanticizes and neutralizes their 5-decade marriage, framing it as a preordained karmic alliance without which neither party would have successfully propagated Buddhist teaching. In fact, the stupa epitaph offers a greater assessment of Zhujin's actual contributions to Buddhist teaching and monastic leadership, views largely absent from Zhuhong's biography. The angst of the biography and unevenness in presentation of events has now disappeared. In downplaying decades of familial strife, there's only a single, albeit biting reference to the moral failings of the Shen clan. And I'll point that out when we get to it. The structure of the epitaph is comprised of 3 distinct texts: a substantial preface, an unremarkable fact-filled biography, and a set of verses, or a eulogy. The preface is divided into 4 short laudatory appraisals, each in turn highlighting one of Zhujin's contributions to Buddhist teaching. Given the unusual circumstances, Wu Yingbin structured his appraisals around a defense of both Zhuhong and Zhujin. The historical trajectory from her youthful marriage to her life as a venerated abbess is cast in karmic terms. Lest the reader miss this point, each of the 4 appraisals ends with a summary statement about their interlocking karma and a refrain. The refrain reinforces the idea that neither of them could have so effectively propagated Buddhist teachings without the mutual support of the other. And in fact, if we rethink Zhuhong's biography of his wife, in some sense, we might feel disappointed that he doesn't say more about her. On the other hand, in analyzing it, we see that he could not have done what he did without her. He needs, although he dominates and she is in a subservient position, in a weaker position, without her voicing of support, his own position becomes far weaker, particularly since his family is not happy about his tonsuring. Nonetheless, the mere fact that this epitaph cannot be unproblematically about Zhujin's life as a nun, which after all is why there is a stupa epitaph in the first place, but must include references to her more publicly known famous monk husband, whose presence dominates the narrative and places her in a subservient position both as his wife and a nun, whose nunnery is governed by the in-house rules he wrote and the donations and the protection, and all of that shows just how difficult the task must have been to write an epitaph that praised her contributions and justified the continuing alliance between these two monastic figures. So there's another needle that needs to be threaded here, and that's that I say this in the article that was distributed, and you see it in the play script, that at this time there were a number of texts that talked about nunneries as houses of ill repute. That maybe the abbess used the young naive novices, maybe she pimped them out to wealthy men. Okay, there is that kind of story, and there's a whole another pornographic literature. I'm not quite sure why the non-celibate find the notion of the celibate becoming non-celibate somehow titillating, but you could write yet another paper on that topic about how nuns and monks are perceived by those that are writing for audiences of those kinds of texts. So he needs to make it clear that this is a religious alliance, a celibate alliance, and yet it's a very important karmically ordained alliance, and it's one that we should celebrate and not one that we should criticize. So the preface begins this way. In witnessing the thundering lion's roar of Chinese Buddhist teachings from the abbess of the nunnery, Filiality and Righteousness Unobstructed, I sighed admiringly that the push and pull of the abbess, and because they use the term, this writer uses the term Lianchi for Zhuhong, I've left it in as Lianchi, but this is Zhuhong or Master Lianchi. Lianchi's interlocking participation in the turning of the Dharma wheel elevated them to the stature of elders of the Lotus teaching. In this, there are 4 inconceivable events. Now, the first sentence is interesting. He says, in witnessing the thundering lion's roar, it could be here that he heard it, but we don't know if how many men went to the nunnery and how many men were allowed access to her teachings, or what the interaction would have been, or whether he simply heard about it from someone else. So the first inconceivable event, and some of this, since we've already talked about it, I won't read all of them, but point out pieces of some of them. This one again points to desire. When the abbess first arrived at the great Master Yuanqi's residence, their passionate desire like oil, and their Buddhist wisdom like fire burned intensely, fearlessly disintegrating in smoke, completely extinguishing them without remainder. Consequently, this extraordinary upaya enabled the great master to leave home and attain the spiritual master, becoming this generation's Dharma platform. Moreover, the great master described the abbess as someone who guided and instructed others through Buddhist methods of teaching. She subdued and consoled disciples. Okay, so she's given a pastoral role, even identifying those who would be future Papayan, the various seeds planted in their hearts, revealed as clear as the reflections in the mirror, the first emperor of the Qing dynasty. Okay, this illusion, this mirror, the ability to look into this mirror and see something before anyone else would know about her ability to look into a heart, look into other people's hearts. It gives her, it portrays her as being very perceptive. It portrays her as having an intuitive ability to really understand disciples and then to guide them. So this is very different from what we just saw. Most assuredly, the completion of the nunnery, filiality and righteousness can be attributed to cloud-dwelling monasteries' inception. This interlocking participation in the turning of the Dharma wheel is the first inconceivable event. And I think that is actually quite true, that without cloud-dwelling monastery, it would have been impossible to put together the nunnery. After all, it's the disciples of cloud-dwelling monastery that then allow for the collecting of the donations to make the nunnery happen. Now, the second inconceivable event gives us much more about her behavior as a nun, much more about her role at the nunnery. The abbess esteemed the pratimoksha. In other words, she kept the rules of the vinaya, the rules that nuns adhere to. Thus, the courtyard held not the trace of a bhikshu. Now, I should add that throughout this, you'll see a lot of Sanskrit terms. And that's because this writer, not only was this writer steeped in his Chinese history and literature and Confucian texts, he knew Buddhist texts, and he liked to use transliterations. And he also used translations, sometimes for the same term, perhaps because one fit better within the structure of the text or fit the rhythm of the text. And so I've then translated them to have the text read about like it would have been in Chinese. It was the result of her pure conduct. The four necessities for monastic living were plentiful. Together with the other residents, she estimated the quantity of food, sized up everyone's needs, and returned the surplus to the kitchens at Cloud Dwelling Monastery. Okay, with this line, it then brings up this question of, was this a branch, like a branch temple, this nunnery function like a branch temple? Did they get all of their provisions from the monastery first, and then send some back? Or did they acquire their own since they were in Hangzhou and near a market? This seems to suggest that perhaps the monastery had an even larger hand in managing the affairs of this nunnery. Now, we see lots of more flowery language here, as he says, for this nunnery of filiality and righteousness, the central aspects of the path to liberation consist of taking singular devotion to reciting the name as tantamount to being fused with fragrance and light. The 6-syllable name is joy in the Dharma, the 3 minds is meditative bliss, and the 9 ranks of the Pure Land is the eternal lamp. Okay, that's all quite flowery language. What he's saying is they recited the name Amitabha Buddha, and they took vows to be reborn in the Pure Land. This is a place of Pure Land practice. And there may have been some meditation there. That's an open question. All of which was possible only by following Master Yuanqi as he pressed forward step by step. In this, the abbess was able to offer him the paramita of giving, and the great master was able to repay her with the paramita of wisdom. Okay, so we're going to see in each of these this pairing of what they each offered each other. We move on to the third one. In this one, notice filial piety is what's most important. The great master took the liberation of helpless of one's ancestors a matter of filial piety, and the universal liberation of all sentient beings is a matter of compassion. And then he goes on to talk about, he says, the abbess employed her upashika body to uphold the precepts and ceremonies with the utmost integrity and attended faithfully to household affairs, including nearly 30 years of pondweed and duckweed offerings to the ancestors. Those are his ancestors, okay? So she took on the roles and duties of making offerings to his ancestors, which then allowed him to go out and be tonsured and to live the life of a monk. Only after the death of Zhuhong's birth mother did she become a nun. At that time, she fulfilled her innermost wish and vowed to be reborn in the Pure Land. In transmitting Vinaya regulations and transforming others by means of upaya, it was as though the dark descent of the setting sun had returned to the light of dawn. Everything the generation of her accomplished disciples, and then lists them all down, relied upon and responded to, the great master had prophesied and strictly regulated. The abbess responded to his righteousness by supplementing the great master's filiality within the inner quarters, just as the great master responded to her filiality by defending the abbess's righteousness in external world of affairs. Okay, so it's really interlocking relationship here. In the last one that I'll discuss, this one talks about the adopted heir. And she says, she's given a voice here, for the sake of Mr. Shun, who left home, there was in fact an heir to perform ancestral offerings. Okay, so even though what's also interesting to me is that these texts, the text of denial and the text of affirmation, are all published in the same set, right? They're all part of the same record. So I guess it just depends on how far along one reads, or if they were published separately before they were gathered together. And then this other section says, moreover, the great master differentiated between monastic and lay and selected the best regulations. Okay, so we've seen that he selected the regulations for them, each and every one of crucial import. It was enough to cause the monastic grounds to surpass in value the contents of the cauldrons of Jiaoru. Even so, As for those who sullied their fingers, could they not have stroked instead their own hearts in self-reflection? Okay, this is the very cutting stab at his clan. Okay, you need to know the story of the Caldons of Jaru. There was a duke who had invited his ministers to a feast, and there was a turtle soup, and turtle soup was considered exquisite and very, very hard to get. And there was a minister who came, and you had to wait to be served. The duke would need to say, okay, I'm going to allow you to have a taste of this soup. And this particular person wasn't offered a taste. He got mad and he stuck his finger in the bowl, licked it, and had his own little taste. And for that time, as the story goes, the duke was so incensed he thought about having that person killed. Okay, so it's a story about a lack of propriety. It's a story about putting one's fingers where they don't belong. It's a story about not honoring other people's boundaries. I think we could put it that way. Okay, so this is the one very cutting reference to the Shun family. We've just gone through the 4 turnings of the Dharma wheel, so I think I'll skip that. And at the end, we come back to this story that I read at the beginning of my paper. And I just want to notice at the bottom it says, and yet their 2 stupas materialize naturally through the inconceivable liberation of the mind of wisdom. And in fact, in the Gazetteers, not the 1934 one, but the earlier Gazetteers, we see here the higher position, the stupa in the higher position is Zhuhong's stupa, and the one in the lower position, that's Zhujin's stupa. Okay, and in the middle we have Cloud Dwelling Monastery. And the epitaph goes on to say, located to the left of the monastery, the great master's stupa faced south, as though he were about to take his seat on the Dharma platform. Located to the right of the Aranya, which is the monastery, the abbess's stupa faced east, as though she were the head of the assembly arriving on incoming clouds. All who saw these stupas thought it miraculous. And then he goes on to add more miraculous signs of birds that show up and various things. And I'm going to skip that section of the epitaph, but it's really quite remarkable that we have both the woodcut blocks that show this in a gazetteer, and then we have the stupa epitaph talking about how this was put together. And I think also there was a sense that husbands and wives should be buried together. And since they were husband and wife, in a sense it resolves both that conundrum, and it makes it a nice monastic showing of where he sat, where she sat, and it gives it a Buddhist gloss. Now the eulogy has 4 sections. They center on wisdom, compassion, the life of bodhisattvas, and rebirth in the Pure Land. And I think it's interesting, we notice this first one says, what the monk manifests is not male, but the nun manifests not female. Equal regard for all sentient beings. They are the mother of the perfection of wisdom. Okay, and then we go on to other ones. Next is their physical embodiment and compassion. And then we move on to one about their ability to teach. They have upaya, or expedient means, and they can use them in such a way that other people don't know. They don't know that they're being taught. They have this mysterious ability to marshal those powers, those skills. And in the final one we have, for kalpas as numerous as flowers and years counted in dust motes, in this land of tranquility, they reside like Narayana. And the 26th vow of the Amitabha Sutra says that those reborn in the Pure Land will have bodies like the Vajra warrior Narayana. So this then puts them in the Pure Land. I just added one photo. Again, this is from the 1934 Gazetteer, which shows where his stupa was located. Unfortunately, all of this was destroyed. And now I think in recent times, there are some plaques, or there's some things that have been put in place, but the original sites are not there anymore. So in conclusion, let me just find my conclusion here. In conclusion, let me say this. The gendered dimension of the two main biographies examined here is undeniable. The stupa epitaph, written to commemorate the life of the abbess of the nunnery of Filiality and Righteousness Unobstructed, weaves a story of mutual beneficence between a celibate monk husband and his nun wife. Her purported acceptance of his severing of familial ties, her fulfillment of his filial duty to his ancestors, and her care of his birth mother permits him to leave his family in pursuit of a monastic life. The monk husband's biography of his nun wife is not written from the perspective of an eminent monk. Much to the contrary, Zhuhong casts himself in the role of a husband who praises his wife's defense of his choice to abandon her at such a young age to pursue a monastic vocation. When her choices align with his, we hear an assured, confident voice. However, when her decisions are contrary to his wishes, his criticism is readily apparent, as is his resentment in raising doubts about her soteriological chances, doubts that are not repeated in any other source. For the late Ming, we have evidence of widowed women taking the tonsure, yet accounts like Zhujin's of a young married woman who remains behind when her husband tonsures and later also follows in his footsteps, presents a unique case study. Because this particular case study is fraught with tension caused by in-laws and adopted son, bent on extracting a greater inheritance, even at the expense of ruining a newly established nunnery, the story is spilled out across a number of texts, including this nun's stupa epitaph and biography. Not only are the texts discussed here devoted to defending the nunnery and cajoling the Shen clan into rethinking their position, other writings like the Stele commemoration and the two final admonitions are also equally committed to that endeavor. Zhuhong harbored a very real concern that the nunnery could again be turned into a domestic residence. Such changes allude to a social practice worthy of greater consideration in our understanding of small monastic residences. Despite the presence of a few prominent officials and donations from a great many people, and Zhuhong says there were 500 donors, the nunnery had a precarious existence. It was constantly threatened by the Shen clan. How long the small nunnery or others like it could generate donations once the main benefactor had passed away is an open question deserving of further research. And we don't have any texts beyond the two biographies in his biographical collection. She dies in 1614, he dies in 1615. What happens to the nunnery and the nuns that are still there or the novices that are still there? That's an open question. Despite the particularities of this couple's story, the broader themes of how to balance renunciation with familial contact, particularly when problems arise, and how to shift the weight of that relationship from one of material sustenance to that of spiritual mentorship, underscores two of the main issues facing 16th century men and women who chose to live in religious communities and may resonate during other times and places. And I'll stop here. Thank you all so much for taking the time to listen. I think that maybe was a little bit long, but I'm open to questions or anything anyone has to say.
Well, anybody, I mean, I have a question, but anybody else want to go first? Well, okay, so I was just wondering about the difference between when Zhuhong alludes to there being a master-disciple relationship with Zhujin and her nephew, but then this reference to the Shen clan being so, predatory. How do you read that? I mean, the stupa epitaph says that she repudiates him, but then Zhudong says that they were master and disciple. So what do you think?
Well, first, we don't have Zhujin's views on this.
Mm-hmm.
That's one.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing gets said about her views. I think that what happens is, well, the Shen clan did not approve of his tonsuring. And he becomes a monk, and they are not happy about that. And he had an inheritance. It went to her, and then she distributes it. They had, if they thought of her, and he calls her this shouzhi, a chaste widow. If they thought of her that way, if she had an affair, they could take over the inheritance and get rid of her. If she remarried, they could take over the inheritance. And so because of her precarious position within that family, they had the power to say, okay, we have this other poor relative, or we have this male, the Shen Wenbin, right? He's from the same clan, but since he married, if Zhuhong is right, that he married into the Shu family, it looks like he married into his wife's family and then becomes a son of this nun. If that indeed happened, we don't have enough documents to know how much of what Zhuhong is saying is the truth and how much of what he's saying are excuses. One thing we do know is he forbids anyone from his clan from ever tonsuring at his monastery. They could go to another monastery, but they can't come into his monastery to tonsure. So I think there's something going on there in terms of this money. And so why does this nephew somehow end up with a Dharma name? And then is he the only male disciple of this nun? And is he allowed into the nunnery, given that no bhikshus are allowed into the nun? So there are lots of contradictory pieces in this. I do think, because of the way that Zhuhong often talks about contracts in other texts, that they have the contracts for the houses, that he talks about who made the donations, that there's some sense that he's litigating this in the court of public opinion. I don't think they took it to court, right? Yeah. But for both the person that wrote this stele inscription and the person that wrote this stupa epitaph, both of them have lots and lots of titles. And all those titles are on those sources. So as you come towards us, and as you say you want to come in, as you say you're going to divide things up, let me just give you some names of people who might protest that, right? So I think there was a real problem. I think the family, I mean, he didn't generate any income for them, right? He left young. He left them no progeny. He left them, the inheritance went to his wife who had no progeny. He was kind of created a mess. I mean, there are other stories of women who become nuns their husband, usually they're widowed, usually the husband dies, right? He dies and he's gone. And then maybe a son becomes a monk and then she becomes a nun. Or there are other happier stories, or the family builds her a nunnery, right? But this is not that story. This is a very different one. Does that help answer your question? Or
yeah,
some kind of response to it?
Yeah. I see Lisa has a question.
Yeah, thank you for a really wonderful and engaging talk. This is going to be an outsider question. So I work on Roman women and their epitaphs. And one thing I was curious about is translation of a term. And so when I'm dealing with Roman women, for example, we use the term in Latin vidua. And widow is but that term can be quite broad in terms of what it means. It can be an abandoned woman, it can be a divorced woman, it can be a widow, it could be a woman that's just been abandoned from her husband for a period of time. And I'm just wondering, in terms of translation choices for the women that you're dealing with, do you see some parallels in that, in terms of how more modern translations could be used to encompass those differences, if you will?
That's a good question. When I translate abandon, it really is in Chinese the word for abandon.
Yeah.
The family does use that term. It's abandoned or dropped her and left, right?
Yeah.
So or the one that's difficult for us sometimes is the term for leaving to be tonsured is chu jia, is to leave home. But in English, if you simply say he left home, to go to the grocery store could be the second half of that sentence, right? So it becomes someone who leaves home with that particular set of characters is leaving home to be tonsured and won't be coming back. Okay, so the term for that I'm using for widow, 受制, she's not a widow, but he uses this term, which means to be chaste.
Yes. Okay.
That and there were at this time chastity cults. Right? So if your husband, if you were betrothed to get married at 18 or 19 and the person you're betrothed to dies, you may become a chaste widow for the rest of your life, right? And then eventually within couple hundred years later, there were even these chastity arches put up in some villages. So if you think about it, if a woman she's 30 years old and she has 3 kids and she has no income, her best hope is to remarry. And the best hope for the clan is that she remarries and somebody picks up the costs, and then she has a couple more kids with that person. And then if she had sons by the first husband, those sons can claim an inheritance when they're older from that family. So sometimes there were all sorts of different kinds of arrangements that were made. But within elite families, it became more and more difficult to do that. And it became more and more a notion of Confucian propriety that a woman never remarries and she remains chaste. But the 受制, to remain chaste, usually he's talking about her as though she's a widow.
Okay, thank you.
Right?
Really
He
helpful.
doesn't talk about her as his wife.
Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
Grace, yeah.
Hi, Dr. Eichman. Thanks for your wonderful talk. I have a question. In my superficial opinion, it was quite common in medieval China for childless couples adopted children of their relatives, such as a nephew, as their heirs. So I'm curious, is it common that a monk or a nun in Ming Dynasty adopt children of their relatives as their heirs? Is it common for nuns or monks, or Zhuhong is a unique case?
This is a unique case in the sense that Zhuhong is already a monk when his wife is not a nun yet. She's living with his relatives and he's not there, and she adopts an heir for him. Right? And then that boy is supposed to do, when she dies, take over the ancestral offerings and the inheritance. And he is not pleased about this. Okay, so the adoption occurs before she becomes a nun. We don't know exactly what year, but it's while he's gone and he's not consulted before this happens, right? And yet, so it makes it really complicated for him.
Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm curious, when you're dealing with those texts that have contradictory views, how do you sort of prioritize them? Or I was curious, I think you mentioned at the beginning you look at genre, or how do you use other kind of devices to look at these contradictory views and sort of decide which one takes priority, or how to tease those out?
I think in this case, there was an adopted son. And he was very unhappy about it, and he couldn't annul that process, right? So the reason I would prioritize that occurred is how often it comes up. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of his response, I think of his response in terms of there's something happened that he doesn't like, and he comes at it from many different directions. right? And he keeps coming back to it again and again and again. And he has to keep coming back to his clan. He has to keep coming back to his family and this nephew being in there somewhere. Okay, so now it could be both the nephew and the clan, or the nephew is the clan's way into saying, we want those houses that were bought and combined to make this nunnery, and we want them back because we're going to do something else with them, right? I think maybe from the clan's point of view, they thought at one point that they could solve Zhujin's situation, right? They could solve Miss Tang's situation before she became Zhujin, and they could solve this must be some poor relative, right, who didn't have a big inheritance, and then they could keep some kind of money in their family, or maybe they just got really, really greedy. So because there are so many different texts that bring that up, I tend to discuss it in terms of the many different perspectives and angles at which Zhuhong attempts to attack the problem. And then the fact that others don't attack it always in quite the same way. They seem to voice that this occurred. Mm-hmm. And in other senses, because we have so many texts, when it comes to talking about funerals, it's very, very rich that he has this, you don't need to do this because we monastics do this. You don't need to do this because we monastics do this, right? So he in fact lays out what a monastic funeral looks like in his point of view, and what a non-monastic funeral would look like in his point of view, right? What he thinks the family would do, and where he thinks that would lead. So I use that. That for me is a happy circumstance, because then it gives me information material about something we might not otherwise know about. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yes, it depends on how many sources you have. I mean, even just there's two biographies. He also has a biography of another nun, Guangjue. And in that biography, he writes it from the point of view of a monk. And she dies very, very young. And he's torn by her death, because she seemed to have a lot of spiritual promise. And she brought in a lot of disciples. And because she died young, a number of people who had been coming to the nunnery suddenly said that they were very unhappy and they weren't going to be Buddhist anymore. And how could she die so young? And so then his voice turns to a pastoral mode, and he gives them reasons to remain Buddhist, despite the fact that she died so young. And for them to think about her differently in terms of having died young, she went to the Pure Land earlier, right? Which is very different from how he talks about his own wife. So these two biographies are very different from what you find in the hagiographical tradition, which is very much sometimes just a template. If you saw those templates and the way she's discussing those templates, you'd never get back to any kind of Shun family machinations over money. It just wouldn't be there, right? It all gets glossed over and all cleaned up, and it all fits. The important thing is she became a nun, she recited the name, she was born in the Pure Land. And now we move to the next one, right? So those kinds of texts tend to be very difficult to analyze beyond analyzing the genre.
Other questions?
Hi.
Well, go ahead, Grace. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Eichman. I have another question about Zhuhong. Maybe it's not related to your today's talk. In your article, you mentioned Zhuhong insisted that nuns shouldn't receive education that specializes in funeral or confessional rituals. Actually, I think this is very controversial. So I'm curious about the reason why Zhuhong insisted that nuns shouldn't receive education that specializes in funeral and confessional rituals. Because I think it's very common that in medieval China, monks and nuns connected with the laities and donors, worshippers, through the rituals, such as funeral rituals, conducting funeral rituals, or praying for the deceased families of laities. I'm just curious about the reason.
That's an excellent question, and I would direct you to read Yu Junfang's entry in the Cambridge Dictionary of Ming China. She has an article that lays out some of that. And what happens at the very beginning of the Ming is the first Ming emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang, he divides monasteries into 3 categories. One of them is the teaching monasteries, another is the Chan monasteries. And the monks in those monasteries, at least in this very early period, this is well before Zhuhong's time, right? Around 13, we'll say 1370s, 80s, late 14th century, early 15th century, right? So during that time, the 3rd group was called Yuqie, which you could translate as yoga, but what it really is, it's rituals for the flaming mouths, ghosts of the hungry ghosts, right? And so the monks and nuns that studied at those institutions were allowed to go out and interact with the populace. And they're called ingfu, right? And this ingfu means on call. In other words, someone dies in the middle of the night. A monk or a nun is called to come to the house and to do recitations. Okay, so it was, and of course, if you did that, then it generated income for that institution, right?
Yeah.
Monasteries don't survive without donations. One way or the other, there has to be some money there somewhere, right? It's naive to think that these things are just what they exist on air. They don't exist on air. They have to have land, right? In a modern context, you have to be able to pay your bills, right? You have to be able to pay your electric bill, your water bill, all those sorts of things. In a pre-modern context, donations came on certain ritual days, right? So the Buddhist birthday or Guanyin's birthday, lots and lots of people will come to a temple or a nunnery. They will participate in some kind of ritual and they will donate. And those donations will keep people fed, monks and nuns fed, for the next 3 months or the next 2 months, or they will allow for repairs to the roof, or they allow someone to buy a new robe, or maybe the material is donated, or rice is donated, or fields are donated, and then they can use the income from the fields to keep the monastery or the nunnery in good repair, right? So the funeral monks and nuns had income or had access to that kind of income, but they were also, because they could go out and because they were given in the beginning, I think, a greater role than the monks that were in teaching and Chan monasteries, right? Those were sidelined, and then this grows, exponential growth. They then are criticized. If you read a lot of novels, you'll see a lot of criticism of avaricious monks, right? So Zhuhong actually reforms a number of funerary procedures. And he did perform funerals, but there might be a difference between an elite establishment like his that had a lot of donations coming in and others that really needed to depend on funeral income in order to survive. Okay, so one thing about this nunnery is when he says there were 500 donors, and then you read the names of the literati with all these titles who were donating silver, right? Or donating quite large sums. Maybe that made it possible for the nunnery to survive without doing all these other kinds of rituals. And because they didn't do those kinds of rituals and they didn't go out and they could elevate their reputation, right? So this was not the other nunnery down the street. This was not a place of ill repute. This was a place where everyone kept the precepts, lived a very regimented life. They got up in the morning, they did what they were supposed to do. They had their evening services and morning services. They recited the name. They had they had rhythms and procedures to their day, right? So it really makes it into a nunnery that is above reproach. And I think that's what he was trying to do. Now, if they needed money, maybe he would have changed his tune on that, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Are you, I have another question. How are you doing? Are you okay to keep going a bit?
I'm okay, yeah.
Okay. So, my source on this is fuzzy. It may have been a conversation with Jimmy Yu at some point, but about Qing chaste widows, Qing dynasty chaste widows, that there was a trend, or there was a phenomenon where if they got widowed young, they would escape to a monastery so that they wouldn't have to be in the household, childless, widowed, in their husband's family, sort of stuck there. And so that was a motivation to take the tonsure and get out of that situation. Do you see that in the Ming as starting in the Ming, or do you see evidence of that?
What I presented today is pretty much a micro history. I don't have the full macro history of all of this, but I would say for this nunnery, if a woman showed up, if a girl showed up and she did not have the permission of a family to be there, she had to be sent back. And I would imagine what changes between the Tang Song period and the Ming is in the Tang and Song period, from what I understand, if your husband dies, you inherit. But in the Ming, you no longer inherit. His family, you inherit in the sense that as long as you follow a certain set of strictures, his family will allow you to stay. But the family had many ways of pushing out women of that sort if they wanted to, right? Or to the contrary, they could write a biography of the chaste widow, right? You get many, many of those too. So my sense would be, it would be to depend on the class of that person, whether it was an elite family or a less elite family, in terms of levels of permission and who went where and how that was accepted.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Interesting. Other questions? I'm trying to see the whole field here. The merit field. Well, so if there aren't further questions, then I'm gonna hang out for a little bit, and people can hang out to have informal discussion, but we'll draw the sort of formal period to an end. And thank you so much, Jennifer. That was really fascinating. I really appreciated the finely grained exegesis on how all of these materials work together. And so thank you so much for this story and demonstration.
Thank you for the invitation.